Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's Techstrong Learning Experience, brought to you by Fairwinds. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning, and we have an exciting panel ahead. First, I'll cover just a couple of housekeeping notes. Today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion, perhaps you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after our live session today. If you have any questions, we'd like you to send those into the Q&A tab, which can be found on the right side of your screen. Over on the right side of the screen, you also see a chat tab. So I'd like you to start warming that up for me right now by letting us know from where you are joining us. We will have a poll that's launched on about the fourth slide in today's program, so do keep an eye out for that. We'd like your participation there. And of course, before we close out, we are giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around to see if you are a winner. Our program today is called Shipping Applications Faster with Kubernetes, Myth or Reality. And our panel consists of Andy Suderman, CTO at Fairwinds, Danielle Cook, co-chair of CNCF Cartographos Working Group and VP at Fairwinds, Grace Goody, engineering manager at Fairwinds, and we have a CRE, SRE, and Nung Bedell from Fairwinds as well. So Nung, Grace, Danielle, and Andy, thank you all so much for being here. Danielle, you want to get this conversation kicked off?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having us. So we do want to ask the question, there is every company out there talking about how they can help ship applications faster with Kubernetes. And we're like, is that true? Does that happen? And so we wanted to have a discussion on what we're seeing in the market and offer it up to you. So if Cody introduced all of us, so there are gorgeous photos, but you can see our faces as well. Just to cover off quickly a little bit about Fairwinds. So we build software for platform engineers. And what we do is help them build platforms that developers can use. So we put in the software that helps them automate security, automate compliance, put policies in place, check their cost optimization, and really help with all these business and mission critical things. So that's how we're coming to you, talking about what we're doing to help platform engineers with Kubernetes. So we do have a polling question, and this is really just to kind of set the bar and see kind of who we have out here. And the question is, what percentage of your infrastructure is on Kubernetes or planned to be migrated in the next 6 months? And we have none, some, half, or all of it. So I'll give you a few minutes to do that.
I stacked the answers. I answered one.
Oh, okay. Well, and while you do that, we can talk about how we accidentally have come up with a pirate theme for today. Nung, dressed like a pirate. Me in my pirate-looking shirt. Total accident.
Andy and I, we missed the memo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Left me out. I'm bummed.
Yeah. It's Gasparilla Pirate season down here in Tampa Bay, where I bring Kubernetes insights on the Fairwinds of Tampa Bay.
Nice. All right. So looking at some of the 33% of you have all of your infrastructure on Kubernetes. That's cool. Some of you, and there's like 24% some. All right, cool. Good to know. That will help us as we're kind of going through this. So to kick it all off, we're going to start with our big question around what problems do developers face when using Kubernetes, because it is not necessarily easy. So I'm going to kick this over to Grace, because Grace, you have a lot of experience with this.
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. So the first thing that comes to mind with issues devs face when using Kubernetes is complexity. Kubernetes can be really difficult to understand and set up, especially for devs who are new to it, because there's a lot of DevOps knowledge that goes into managing even a simple cluster. And more devs are expected to be, building complicated features on a cadence along with managing these Kubernetes clusters. And that's a lot to ask. Often devs are tempted to manually edit YAML files, for example, and that's very error prone. So they have to learn even more tools like Helm or kube control. So yeah, really complex. I'd say that's one of the biggest issues devs face.
Well, and so, we see that, and we see that around with, a number of different devs just getting more and more pressure. And, in chatting with people, they're saying we need to give devs a helping hand. because they can't be expected to know everything. So, Andy, I'm just going to throw this over to you. Like, what would make a developer's life easier?
Yeah, I mean, we've spent a lot of time running Kubernetes clusters for lots of different companies. It's kind of our history, and I've been involved with that for a long time. And one of the things, that we really lean on is partially just education. So we spend a lot of time just teaching developers about things and how things work, and the consequences of the way that they're deploying things into Kubernetes. But that sort of only gets you so far. It can really help, and I think developers really need to have some level of understanding of the things that they're deploying, but that doesn't really cover all the bases. And we've found over the years that all of the major problems that we have with Kubernetes are not with running Kubernetes. Like, we can run a cluster, but when people deploy stuff, that's when it breaks, right? And then they deploy stuff that is misconfigured or things like that. I think, Nung, you're on the pager rotation these days. You get to deal with that on a regular basis.
Yep. Yeah, and I also remember helping developers transition from it worked on my computer situation with Docker Compose, and then when you ship their containers to your staging environment, and then it's failing there, and then teaching and helping them figure out how to troubleshoot in the Kubernetes cluster versus in their Compose.
Well, and so this goes nicely into our next question, because this does not sound like it's easy. And if I'm using Kubernetes because I'm trying to speed things up and get apps out faster, and you've all just mentioned all these challenges for developers, like, does it truly speed things up? Andy, what do you think?
mean, yes and no, right? Like, it can speed things up. It can provide a platform for people to speed things up, but by increasing complexity, you're always going to slow down a little bit. I think the important thing that we need to focus on is not speeding things up. Deploying software and getting it out there is easy if you do it however you want, right? I can throw up whatever I want in the cloud and get an application running. But the important thing that we need to be asking ourselves is not, can we go faster, but can we go faster while also being efficient, reliable, and secure in the way that we're doing it? And so I think this is a little bit of a sort of a bad way to talk about it. It's just like, let's go faster, let's go faster, let's go faster. Well, that's not a sustainable practice. So we need to think more about, can it make things faster while being more secure and all of those things? And that, I think, is totally possible with Kubernetes.
Well, and so related to that, so it's interesting because, we're talking about developers, we talked about the challenges they face. So platform engineering, also known as DevOps and SREs, and, there's all lumped into this platform engineering. Like, what do they need to do? Because they're turning into a help desk to try and do this. So what are some of like the challenges that you as a platform engineer would face trying to make this easier for developers?
That's a great question. I'll let somebody else answer if they want. But I think, putting in place guardrails and providing sort of a happy path or a paved road, I think, is some of the terminology we've been using recently for developers to get their applications into production without facing all of these pitfalls. And so putting in place tooling. So in our services arm, one of the things that we've done from day one is we put tooling in the cluster that provides services to developers, basically. So we deploy things like external DNS and cert manager and an ingress controller. And so now we've limited like the options that they can deploy into the cluster, but they get a bunch of stuff for free by following the happy path that we've set for them. They get DNS out of the box. They get SSL certificates out of the box. So some of the security things are baked in. And so the further we can go down that road of putting in tooling and add-ons and restrictions really on top of that, the more we can sort of pave the road. I'm going to say that probably 12 times now today because but we can create that happy path for developers to quickly and easily get things into production while being safe, secure, and efficient.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think making sure that the dev can, I think devs are often used to running things on their local environment, and can be hard to really emulate a cluster. But if you have a good platform team that provides these resources, Andy mentioned, it really does help the devs.
And so with
documenting what that happy path is instead of just relying on a script for them to to absorb how you build and deliver your code on your platform. Having the guardrails in place to keep you in the right spot, but documentation so that they understand how to troubleshoot the build, how to troubleshoot their application once it's out there in the cloud, where to get their logs, how to log into the cluster, because some of them are logging into Kubernetes for the first time. And when you're developing on your own computer, you don't need all this stuff because it's all there, with all the accesses that you have. Where out there in the cloud, you also have the guardrails so that you can't go into areas and namespaces that are restricted, which if they're deploying an application to an environment that they have no access to, they have no visibility, and that can be very frustrating.
I love that distinction, because I think so many times we get into this conversation with, developer platforms or internal platforms or whatever you want to call it, that the idea is abstraction. People always say like, oh, the developers shouldn't have to care about where their application is being deployed. But that's not the goal here. The goal is an abstraction. It's providing a happy path while also teaching them how to walk down it and understanding it. So, it's super important to have that documentation that outlines it so that they're learning how to deploy and what's going on, rather than just throwing code over the wall, because that's what we're trying to get away from.
Yeah. I feel I do get frustrated when I hear from developers like, oh, I don't want to hear about this. I don't want to learn about this. But then it's like, well, that's where your code's running. Maybe you should learn a little bit about it more and understand it.
Well, and I think that's interesting to move on to our next question, because, we've talked about, okay, can Kubernetes speed things up? Yes-ish, right? We've talked about that, but, have the benefits of Kubernetes been oversold to all of us? And Nung, I want to throw that one over to you.
Yeah, that's a really, I think, big question that a lot of people and a lot of managers want to understand, because they hear about Kubernetes being the latest and greatest, the shiny object. It can be overkill if you're trying to host just a website, but if you have all kinds of a myriad of microservices out there running and multiple containers in different platforms, it can give you an environment that is that your DevOps team can support, because there is sort of a uniformed way of delivering those services and those containers. Developers may want to just opt for some kind of container delivery service like ECS or Google Cloud Run, Fargate, or opt for something simpler, or in their eyes simpler, like Nomad Console. I also feel like there isn't enough core competency in the development community versus the DevOps community. And, a lot of developers who do like infrastructure tend to just start to migrate over to become DevOps.
So, that's like an interesting distinction. Like, developers that like the infrastructure side want to become DevOps, but the developers who want to actually do app dev, they don't want to be bothered with Kubernetes. So I guess that leads to the question of like, okay, so if you're creating this, I like that we're calling it happy path. That's a new term, or the happy path, the golden path, the internal developer platform.
Yeah, it's better than walking the plank.
Yeah, should be doing on International Pirate Day. So, what are the reasons you would need Kubernetes? Like, so, things like multiple teams, or like you would use it for that, and then creating this golden path, like why would you do that? Like,
I mean, Noah already touched on this, but don't use Kubernetes if you've just got one app and, you only need to deploy, one static website or something like that. Like, that's overkill, like hardcore overkill. It is a very complex and large tool, and it needs to be treated as such, right? We need to implement it in smart ways So if you have a team that needs to provide a developer platform, Kubernetes is a great place to start with that. And it gives you a lot of tools to do that. But in a very small environment, it seems like more complexity than is worth it.
Well,
Yeah, I think it often.
Grace, sorry, no, you
I
go.
was just going to say, I think often Kubernetes is oversold to kind of smaller companies, and there is maybe some overkill. Maybe they don't need the RBAC or the monitoring or the logging, a lot of things that are just built in, but bigger corporations really do benefit from a lot of these built-in features. So I'd say more oversell to smaller companies.
Well, and I like one of our participants said, I think developers need example patterns from code to build to deploy. What they don't want to do is hack stuff together themselves. I like that a lot. So, most of the people on this call, I think it was 90% hadn't got to Kubernetes, but most people, the rest had. If you're a platform engineer or you're managing this, like, are you becoming a help desk, and like, why does that happen? And what are the things that you need to put in place to avoid becoming a help desk? Andy, Nung, either one of you want to start on those?
Yeah, I mean, Nung touched on a bit of it earlier, and I think we were just talking about it in the chat there. It's, developing patterns, putting out that documentation, and then the guardrails to prevent it. So, making it harder to deploy things that are improperly configured or not set up correctly, and all of those examples to go with it. And then, quick feedback loops, I think, is something that is super important, because like, if I'm a developer and I have this example YAML that I've pulled in, from the documentation, I'm like, okay, I'm going to deploy my app with this. And, I chuck it into our infrastructure repository, whatever your workflow is. And then the system rejects it and says, hey, you can't deploy this. Well, that's a terrible experience, right? We need these feedback loops back into our CI/CD systems to say, this is what's wrong now. You've made this pull request, you've made this change request. Now here's what's wrong, here's why. And so tooling that makes the feedback loops faster and brings the best practices to the developers at where they're working, rather than just gatekeeping at the cluster.
Well, and I really like that differentiation of where they're working. So not introducing another tool that just gets in their way, or not introducing another tool that they're like, okay, I got to log in here and do this. But like, if your developers, they're using GitHub, they're committing code to it, there's a problem, it creates Jira ticket, like stuff that they're using. I think that's an important thing. And I love some of the comments that are coming over. I handled a medium fleet with Puppet. Scaling and moving resources was a nightmare. Or Kubernetes, scale, done. I like it.
I also ran a medium fleet with Puppet, and it was horrible at my last company. And then I discovered the joy that is Kubernetes.
Nice.
Another participant pointed out versioning, which is definitely difficult too, and hard to figure out.
Yeah, add-on management is a whole separate part of building your developer platform that, it's not focused on the development side of things, but it's in providing that tooling and those services to your customers, who are the developers. Like, managing those add-ons and all the extra stuff that they need is hard, and it takes a lot of effort. And tooling to make that easier also is important, because there's a lot of dependencies, and also not hosting things that don't belong in Kubernetes. Right. Your database, like, there's a service in your cloud provider to do that. Use that. Like, that's the place to do that.
Yeah, I do find managing your add-ons, though, I guess easier in Kubernetes than, say, just out there in the cloud in, whatever you're running it in open containers, where especially if you do something like deploying with Helm charts, because then you can just compare charts between clusters and, upgrade, deploy, done.
Right. Yeah. And then you move to a GitOps model, and it gets even easier. Pull request, merge, done. So.
And always remember, don't set your image pool policy to latest.
I love we're just getting into like the tips of it all. Like, and exactly. I love it because there's so many right things to do and wrong things to do. And like this question around what does an internal developer platform need? It's like, well, we can run through a list of like, hey, make sure you're doing these things. But how do you actually know if it's happening. Like, do you don't necessarily have visibility into all your clusters at all the same time, and you have multiple teams checking in on it. So it's like, well, what does an internal developer platform need, or the golden path? What are the checks you need to have in place? What best practices? Do you want to be able to customize it? So I don't know, just who do you want to throw over to answer this question or talk about this a little bit?
I want to hear Grace's opinion on this, because she's the one who manages our development team, or part of it. And so like your point of view on this is much different than mine. And so I want to hear your opinion.
Totally. Well, first of all, I'll say that Kubernetes is a great candidate for an IDP because of how scalable and flexible it is. And I think it's really important that that IDP provides developers with a centralized environment for building, testing, and deploying applications, and make sure that applications can be deployed in a consistent and predictable manner. And also, it can include built-in features for disaster recovery and failover. So yeah, I would say making sure that that environment is really centralized, especially for deploying and using those tools that are built in.
Yeah, it's a great place for your distributive development team to collaborate, because if you have a developer out developing on their own, they have their own workflow, their own build cycle that they're doing. Having a internal developer platform, and asking them to bring that in, set up their builds there, allows other developers to collaborate. And then that's within one team. But then let's say you have a Java team and you have a .NET team and a Python team. Everybody works on different services. And then eventually all those services have to come together in a platform and work together. And then one developer is trying to interact with a service that another development team works on. But if they didn't have access to the different platforms that each one of these teams work on, they're having to do a lot more intergroup communication. Whereas if you had, say, a centralized platform that everyone would have to, set up their builds, they could then interact in an even quicker and more transparent manner.
That's a good point. That's a really good point. I'm going to bring in one of the questions from the Q&A here, but somebody asked, what security considerations should we be looking into? I think that's a really important thing to think about, because out of the box, Kubernetes not overly secure, right? A lot of the defaults sort of not ideal. And so, lots of security considerations, but primarily, using your cloud provider offered, setups for building your clusters, using tooling that brings that feedback about, known vulnerabilities or misconfigurations back into your CI/CD pipeline, and then, various policies and things like that to enforce these standards across your clusters. I think one of the things that you run into when building these developer platforms is just consistency across clusters. And while it's relatively straightforward to do in Kubernetes, like, you can do it because it's, a declarative API. I can declare each cluster has to look the same, but you have to have tooling in place to make that, legitimate, to make that actually happen.
Well, and I was talking to an infrastructure director of infrastructure last week who said standardization is the sexiest term for him. And, we're not going to dig too far into that statement, but it's like this standardization, because it can be a hot mess if you don't have standardization in place. I think there was another question too. Let's see. Well, there was another comment asking, like, is service mesh forbidden term in this webinar?
I have a standard answer to that question, and it is everyone wants a service mesh because they think they need it, because somebody told them they need a service mesh, just like everybody thinks they need Kubernetes because somebody told them they need Kubernetes. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is solve problems and launch infrastructure. And we have requirements for that infrastructure, right? Kubernetes solves some of the problem, gives us the tools to solve the problems of scalability, high availability, and things like that. Well, Service Mesh gives us another set of tools for solving some issues around, a deeper level of security and a deeper level of visibility. And if those are requirements that your organization has and you have a problem you're legitimately trying to solve, then Service Mesh can totally be the right answer for that. But the answer to that question is never, yes, you need a service mesh out of the box by default. Yes. just like you don't need Kubernetes out of the box by default.
Yeah, and I'm glad you just touched on that one point, because here I am in the chat saying, well, I like Linkerd, and one of the things I really like about it was the how I was able to drill down into the path and watch calls come in and see where those calls go on an application I know nothing about, because I didn't write it, and I'm helping the customer trace these calls to a certain path and a certain service, and we're able to look at how the pods are loaded up by a certain request.
Right.
There was another question about security. Sorry to interrupt, Danielle. And I think, Kubernetes does provide a really secure environment, but it doesn't address all security concerns. I think some that come up are securing communication between applications, access control, and data encryption, making sure your data is protected. I think those are some of the first things that come to mind for me on security.
Yeah, definitely. RBAC is something that I think gets often overlooked because people, it's confusing. It's difficult in Kubernetes. It can be tricky. So I think that's a very often overlooked first step that folks need to take a look at. And then, isolating applications between namespaces and considering network policy. I think, when we get into the security conversation, it's hard to make blanket recommendations because security is very complicated and it all depends upon your threat model completely. Like, we don't worry too much about internal cluster security as much because we have a small team developing a single app in a single cluster. I don't have, 500 apps running across 500 different namespaces. That's a completely different threat model for people like that. We're not running, untested code. We're not running like foreign code in our cluster, right? It's just code that we've written. We have customers who have people who are running in like isolated environments where they're actually like writing code in sort of these like development environments. And that's a whole different model about security. And so I think you have to think about what your threat model is there. But yeah.
So I'm gonna skip on to the next question around, and please keep the questions coming because it's great having all these comments. So the security question relates to this around what does an internal developer platform need, and it is definitely security checks, right? Like there are, Andy, you said, hey, we can't blanket requirements because of your threat tolerance level, but at the same time, maybe you shouldn't be running containers as root. Maybe you should make sure your insecure capabilities are secured. There's just some certain things that you should be scanning for when it comes to security. Likewise with reliability and also just efficiency of your app. So let's talk a little bit about what those checks might be, or what are some tips that you should be looking for.
Are you saying I shouldn't run all my containers as privileged with host networking and mounting the Docker socket on every host, by default?
I mean, totally
that's my default. No.
If you can do that and then put all your bank money and whatnot details in there, and I'll just go in and make some money off of you. That'd be great.
Awesome.
And IDP, just to say IDP, sorry, I do this, the internal developer platform. And Andy mocks me about this because he's like, IDP is not that. It's security.
It's an identity provider. That's the security term.
I know, but every time I say internal, it's just like, ooh. I think we're just going to call it Happy Path from now on. I like that. Okay. Yeah. So let's talk about, we talked a little bit about security. So Andy, you want to dig a little bit deeper on that, just the definite things to be scanning for, and then we'll go into reliability and efficiency.
Yeah, I mean, those basic configurations around security, not running as root, setting your seccomp profiles, not you're running privileged containers where you don't need to, not using host volume mounts, some of the basic stuff, that isn't necessarily set by default in Kubernetes, but is relatively straightforward to do if you're, consciously building for Kubernetes. And then another one is RBAC. Make sure you have, sane RBAC profiles across your environment. For the service accounts running in it, as well as your users, and then, actual authorization for users logging, not giving everyone cluster admin by default. Those are some of the easy basics that we recommend.
Well, and let's talk about, I mean, again, with reliability, availability, there are some apps that, of course, need, 100% uptime. I don't even know if 100% uptime is possible. 99.9999 uptime.
10 nines.
Yeah.
And then there's ones that don't. So, like, what do I need to do to make sure that my application is reliable and available? What are some checks I should put? Anyone? Should I be making sure there's some liveness probes set? Let me just,
Yeah, all the basic stuff, right? That it, you know,
Well, basic stuff for you, but for a
restarts,
developer, they
restart
might not be
policies.
doing that.
Yeah. Liveness probes, readiness probes more specifically are far more important. I mean, liveness probes are definitely important as well, but readiness probes, making sure you're not routing traffic to pods that aren't ready to accept it. And then I will, jump on my standard soapbox of resource requests and limits. Resource requests and limits. I saw somebody comment in the chat that they had trouble getting auto scaling to work correctly. 9 times out of 10, it's that you haven't set resource requests and limits correctly, because scaling is based on your resource request, and auto scaling of your cluster is based on your resource request as well. So everything hinges on the resource request and limits, and that can affect both your, efficiency and your reliability and your ability to auto scale like you want to. So those are super important. And if you can, don't scale on CPU, scale on something else, anything else.
Well, and so the efficiency statement, I mean, obviously we're all living in an interesting market at the moment where, people are trying to save money and they're trying to save money on the cloud. And so being able to show like, hey, this is where we're spending on our Kubernetes applications and this is where we're optimizing it is super important. And that does relate to your CPU settings, your memory settings. So you'll want to make sure you're checking those and your developers aren't just open-ending, not setting them.
I've seen a lot of workloads that go out without limits, or when the limits come in at, let's use 20 CPU and then set a limit of 2,000. And it's like the delta between them is so great, and maybe work at trying to make them closer together so therefore they're a little more meaningful, and that the workload will respond to slight changes in amped up CPU or RAM.
Right. Over provision.
Mm-hmm. I'm reading one of the comments. We're working on an IDP concept, although I'm new to the idea that this is a well-defined thing. Okay. And we are struggling that our prod version of the app is not much different in resource use than when the IDP would need it. And that's a lot.
I think when we talk about internal, I think it's important to distinguish here. When we talk about internal development platform, that means all the way through to prod, right? Developers should be responsible for their apps to some degree all the way through the platform. And so that includes your development environment, your staging environment, and your production environment. And we do have, just addressing sort of the sizing and cost thing, we definitely see this as well. Our staging environment, we spin up a full copy, including a database and an S3 compliant data store and a time series database for every single branch that gets made. And yes, it's a little bit expensive from an infrastructure perspective, but the amount of time it saves us in troubleshooting and issues going from development to prod is huge. It's well worth the extra infrastructure cost for us. Obviously, you have to evaluate that in your situation, but for us, it's been a really worthwhile trade-off.
Awesome. There's another question. I'm not sure. I definitely don't know the answer to this. It's service intercommunication is a big issue. Jason has many problems enforcing contracts. gRPC is really complex. What's the option?
I mean, that's a development architecture problem. That's not an infrastructure problem.
Okay. Because I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, contracts between services is complex and it's been difficult to keep track of. And, that's something that I think that's an application architecture concern that you should definitely address, but I don't know that we're here to talk about that today.
Okay, cool.
There was also a comment that CI/CD is integral, and totally agree. And then that's a complex thing to get right. too. But CI/CD, very, very important part of the IDP for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Like I was talking about with those ephemeral environments that we spin up for each developer, that's in our same cluster as our staging environment where we run all of our tests, and we run tests against the ephemeral environments too. And so there's a lot of testing in CI/CD at that point.
Well, and so this moves nicely into we're gonna do a plug, of course, for Fairwinds Insights.
Fairwinds, new name.
I like that.
Yeah. New name, everyone. So this is really software for platform engineers, and it's so that you can have a look into what's actually happening with your clusters. You can manage it. You can set policies for your developers, and then have your developers like use it in the tools they're already using. So, hey, it's going to check in dev, it's going to check through prod, it's going to make sure the configurations are done right. And if they're not, it's going to tell your developers why it's not done right, perhaps open a ticket if needed, if you have that integrated, so that you can make sure that your code and your code quality is all adhering to your compliance requirements, your security requirements. It really keeps everyone happy at the organization and make sure that you're maximizing your investment in Kubernetes. So we have a little kind of 3 different areas and business critical areas, and Andy's going to talk a little bit about this.
All right, I am. So yeah, these are all things that we've touched on today, but I can talk a little bit about how Insights plays into each one of these. So in the security space, we integrate a couple of different open source tools. So we have Polaris is our open source that checks for best practices. Some of those things that we talked about, like setting, running containers as root, setting your resource requests and limits. It has the ability to check for those as well as enforce them as an admission controller, and keep things from getting in the cluster with those misconfigurations. In addition to that, we integrate with a container scanning solution to provide information about known CVEs in your cluster, as well as in your development pipelines. So we can surface all of this information both at the CI/CD level, at admission time, and then running in a live cluster. And so you can see, how many critical CVEs you might have, or you can prevent those from being deployed into the cluster if they're already known. So that's the primary things from the security side. And then cost optimization. Sure.
We're just all changing words right now.
Optimization. So we talked about setting your resource requests and limits, but we provide additional information using Prometheus metrics to provide recommendations about how to set those. So if they're not set high enough, or if you need to set them a little bit lower, if you're over provisioning, as well as providing that show back of cost that I think Danielle was talking about, showing what namespaces, what apps are costing the most of your compute across your Kubernetes environment. And then we also have open source in that area, a project called Goldilocks. And then the third one, policy and guardrails. We already talked a little bit about policy and guardrails with Polaris, because this ties very closely into security. But you can add additional custom policies that might be, specific to your business. This also plays back into cost optimization, where you may want to enforce a labeling scheme so that you can do proper, attribution of costs across your environment. And so adding in custom policy via OPA or Polaris, we're also working. We have custom policies via Polaris that can also be enforced again at CI/CD, admission, or in a live cluster. And so lots of options for all of this across the board.
Awesome. We do have a question in the chat, which I think potentially could relate with replicas, but any testing tools for Kubernetes you'd recommend for scalable testing? E.g., can we set a replica number given expected throughput, but if it periodically jumps 10 times in production? I think the question, I can't see the rest of the comment. Maybe that's it.
I think that's it. I'm happy to answer it, but I've also been talking a lot, so I want to open the floor if anybody else wants to answer it.
Would you need any specific Kubernetes testing tools versus, say, the same testing tools you would use to test your application, even if it were deployed, say, in ECS, or just some other platform? I mean, you want to test it like someone on the internet would come in and
right.
approach your application, right?
For a load testing scenario, I totally agree with you.
Yeah,
You know, any
benchmarks.
sort of
Yeah.
benchmarking or load testing tool. I think a couple of things I've seen interesting in this area. First of all, auto scaling via metrics that are not CPU. So setting your horizontal pod autoscalers up to scale your pods, but on a metric that is more indicative of actual performance. So whether that's latency or whether it's, you know, number of requests, or actually I saw a really interesting talk from KubeCon about scaling on active threads. That was super interesting. So if somebody finds that that talk, there's a really interesting one there. But scaling on CPU is just a terrible idea. And then there's one other tool that I'll actually talk about that because it's kind of cool. I played with it a long time ago before they got bought and merged with another company. But it's called, I think it's now called StormForger. It used to be called Carbon Relay. But what they actually did was set up a mechanism in Kubernetes for you to run load tests against your cluster and then do experiments with different replica counts and different scaling settings. And then it would use machine learning to generate new tests. And then it would try to optimize for certain variables. So if you want to get really into the weeds on like complex testing and load testing and benchmarking, that's an interesting place to look.
Awesome. And then there's another question around read coding, design, circuit breaker, fault injection. Can these be integrated into Kubernetes for application reliability?
And now we get back to service mesh, because if you want to do those things, if you really want to introduce some interesting, you know, circuit breakers, fault injection, you want to do, you know, introduce retries, those things can all be done with the service mesh, and it's a great candidate for those. So if that's an area that you're looking to get into, definitely check out the various service mesh options. And I too like Linkerd too. I'm a big fan.
Nice. Well, and I'm going to make a little plug. We're doing a virtual event with Buoyant called Cube Crash in a few weeks. So you can look at that. It's just cubecrash.io, where we're talking about a ton of open source. We're pairing with Buoyant. We're going to talk about zero trust. It's going to be really good. So in case you want to join that, check that out. So we'll wrap by saying, listen, Fairwinds Insights, you can try it for free if you are using Kubernetes, if you have multiple teams using it, if you're if you're a platform engineering team or DevOps and you are just spending all your time as a help desk, try it out. It is going to make your lives easier, and you will, you know, end up shipping applications faster because the end result is like dev velocity increases. And Andy made a face because he's like, well, it does increase it, but it's, you know, because devs.
That's not the point.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm an ops engineer. We always want to go slower because change introduces risk. And so, but I also recognize that we have to ship applications because that's what we do.
Hey, revenue generating for all of the companies.
Right.
Okay, so I think we've answered all the questions. I don't see any more, but, you know, feel free to get a question in now if you want it. And, you know, I like that participant says Cube Crash is a cool name. It is a cool name.
That Cube Crash is going to be really cool, by the way. I'm very excited. I've been working with the folks to develop the demo that they're building, and it's going to be super exciting.
Awesome. Cody, I think back to you.
Well, I did want to give our audience about 1 more minute to send in any questions they might have. So just to stall for some time, let's go ahead and give away some gift cards. So our 4 winners of our $25 Amazon gift card drawing are Rovin S, Nick D, Tatiana S, and Hadil R. So to our 4 winners, please keep an eye on your inbox. You should be receiving that gift card in about the next 48 hours. If you don't happen to see that email, do check your spam folder. I'll also remind everyone that this session was recorded, so you will be receiving an email with a link to access the recording on demand, or of course you can find it living on the Container Journal website at containerjournal.com/webinars.
Awesome.
Danielle, did any more?
One more question came in which said, you mentioned governance. Is this approach best for people looking to get FedRAMP ATO?
I mean, compliance is a whole different world of things, governance and policy plays into compliance, but it's only part of the story. And it can be valuable there, but also FedRAMP has a whole nother slew of requirements on top of that that's more about how you operate as a development team in a company rather than the actual details of how your infrastructure is working. And that's true of many compliance frameworks.
Okay.
There was another question about using Kubernetes with computing at the edge, and I asked for clarification, and it came in that they were talking more specifically about IoT devices out there on the edge, and then interacting with the Kubernetes cluster. And I feel like you're going to have the same challenges as you would in your traditional deployment. One of the things you have to probably consider is how are those IoT devices going to interact with your clusters, streaming all that data? Are you going to use, something like Kinesis and then have that's one of those services you would have outside your Kubernetes cluster that would then relay messages to your cluster versus, say, running that service in your cluster. It's probably a good topic for another discussion, running IoT devices in Kubernetes versus traditional platform.
Yeah, that's a whole nother webinar right there.
Yeah, but I wanted to give it some love because it was good, something to think about.
Awesome.
We'll have to start getting ready for the next webinar, it sounds like.
Right?
You can count me out of that one.
None's going to leave that one.
I know enough to know.
All right. Well, I think we're a wrap. Thank you, everybody who attended. And, everybody, I think, Cody, you'll be sending a follow-up email. We'll send some follow-up, and we can, there's one more question. Can we move control plane away from data plane? I think that was just
Yes, you can split your control plane and your data plane. I've honestly never done it. It doesn't seem worthwhile to me, but that's another discussion. So
another webinar.
Another webinar. Here we go.
Yeah, not doing that.
All right. I think with that, we're a wrap.
All right.
Well, Andy, Danielle, Grace, Nung, thank you all so much for joining me. I really appreciate the time it takes for you to put together these presentations, to join us, and then put in thought into your costume and everything. Nung. So thank you all so much for being here.
Andy and I will do better next time with our costumes.
I'd like to thank Fairwinds for sponsoring our program today, and to everyone who has joined us. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate your time, and we also really appreciate and value your feedback. As soon as we close out, there will be a survey that pops up on your screen. Tell us what you liked about our program or what you'd like to see on an upcoming program. Otherwise, we do hope to see everyone at a future Techstrong learning experience. Have a great rest of your day, and thanks again, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, everyone.